Sarah, you need to explain these attendance patterns immediately. My supervisor, Marcus Williams, slid a printed attendance report across his desk. His expression, a mixture of suspicion and barely contained irritation. According to our records, you've been absent from the office 43 days in the past 2 months. That's completely unacceptable for someone in your position. I stared at the document, noting the meticulous tracking of my supposed absences, each date highlighted in yellow marker-like evidence in a criminal case. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them at Davidson Financial Solutions knew, was that every single one of those days I had been working more hours than anyone else in the building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I just hadn't been working from this particular building. You see, while Marcus thought he was disciplining a mid-level marketing coordinator who was slacking off, he was actually questioning the attendance of the chairman of the board of directors for the entire Davidson Financial Group. The morning that would eventually lead to that confrontation had started like so many others over the past 18 months. My alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning in my downtown penthouse apartment, exactly 47 floors above the bustling streets of Chicago. The city stretched out beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, a tapestry of early morning lights and the distant hum of traffic beginning to build for another day. I had purchased this apartment 3 years ago under my married name Sarah Chen Martinez, while my professional identity at Davidson remained Sarah Chen, the unassuming marketing coordinator who had supposedly worked her way up from an entry-level position over the past 4 years. The deception wasn't born from malice or some elaborate scheme for personal entertainment. It had emerged from necessity, from a desire to understand the true heartbeat of the company my family had built from the ground up. When my father, David Chen, had suffered his massive heart attack 2 years ago, I had inherited not just his position as chairman of the board, but also his deep concern about the disconnect between executive leadership and the daily operational reality of our employees. He had spent his final months expressing worry that Davidson Financial had grown too large, too impersonal, that the leadership had lost touch with the people who actually made the company function. I had been working in strategic consulting for McKinsey at the time, helping Fortune 500 companies navigate complex organizational transformations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being called home to help transform the very company where I had spent my childhood summers, learning about business from my father's knee. But unlike the external consulting work where I could observe and recommend from a distance, this situation required something more intimate, more authentic. I needed to understand Davidson Financial, not from the executive boardroom perspective, but from the ground level where policy decisions became daily reality for thousands of employees. So I had created Sarah Chen, the marketing coordinator. I crafted a believable resume with experience at smaller financial firms, carefully designed to show competence, without exceptional achievement that might draw unwanted attention. I interviewed for the position just like any other candidate, though I made sure the hiring manager was someone who wouldn't recognize me from the few company events I had attended in my youth. The position was in the marketing department of our Chicago branch office, far enough removed from the executive headquarters in New York that I could maintain my dual existence without constant risk of exposure. The plan had been simple: spend 6 months in the role, gather insights about employee experience, management effectiveness, and organizational culture, then transition back to my board responsibilities with a deeper understanding of how to lead the company more effectively. What I hadn't anticipated was how compelling the work would become, how much I would learn not just about Davidson Financial but about leadership, authenticity, and the complex dynamics that exist between different levels of an organization. As I prepared for my day that morning, I followed the same routine I had established over the past year and a half. First, I reviewed the board materials that had been sent to my secure email overnight. Davidson Financial was in the middle of a major digital transformation initiative, one that I had been advocating for since taking over as chairman. The quarterly reports showed promising progress, but the devil was always in the details, in how these grand strategic initiatives actually affected the daily work experience of our employees. Today's board materials included updates on the new customer relationship management system rollout, revised performance metrics for branch managers, and a concerning report about employee satisfaction scores in several regional offices. The satisfaction scores particularly caught my attention because they seemed to contradict the positive feedback we were receiving from middle management about the digital transformation progress. As chairman, I could request detailed analysis and explanations, but those reports would be filtered through multiple layers of management, each potentially adding their own spin or interpretation to protect their positions. As Sarah Chen, the marketing coordinator, however, I experienced these initiatives directly. I had spent the past month learning to navigate the new CRM system alongside my colleagues, listening to their frustrations during coffee breaks, observing how the implementation was actually affecting productivity and morale. The reality was far more complex than what reached the boardroom level. I finished reviewing the board materials and shifted my attention to my coordinator responsibilities for the day. The marketing department was launching a new campaign for our small business lending products, and I had been assigned to coordinate the social media component with our external advertising agency. It was detailed work that required collaboration with multiple departments, from legal review to graphic design to regional sales teams. The project had given me remarkable insight into how decisions made at the executive level rippled through the organization, often in ways that the decision-makers never fully understood. At 7:15, I began my commute to the office, though commute was perhaps too strong a word for the 15-minute walk from my apartment building to the Davidson Financial Chicago branch office. I had specifically chosen the apartment for its proximity to the office, ensuring that I could maintain a consistent presence as Sarah Chen while still fulfilling my chairman responsibilities, which increasingly required flexible scheduling for board meetings, investor calls, and strategic planning sessions. The walk through downtown Chicago had become one of my favorite parts of the day. It provided transition time between my two identities, allowing me to mentally shift from Sarah Chen Martinez, the chairman dealing with multi-million-dollar strategic decisions, to Sarah Chen, the marketing coordinator focused on campaign deliverables and department collaboration. The change was more than professional. It was psychological, requiring a completely different mindset and set of priorities. As I entered the Davidson Financial building, I nodded to Robert, the security guard, who had worked there for over a decade. He knew me as the friendly marketing coordinator, who always arrived early and never forgot to ask about his daughter's progress in nursing school. What Robert didn't know was that I had been reviewing his employment file just the week before during a board discussion about employee retention and support services. His dedication and institutional knowledge were exactly the kind of assets that often went unrecognized at the executive level, but became clearly visible when you worked alongside people every day. The marketing department occupied the 8th floor of the 15-story building, positioned strategically between the loan processing departments below and the executive offices above. I had come to appreciate this middle position as a perfect vantage point for understanding organizational dynamics. Marketing coordinated with virtually every other department, from product development to sales to customer service, providing natural opportunities to observe how different parts of the company actually functioned together. My desk was in a cluster with 5 other marketing professionals, each handling different aspects of campaign development and implementation. To my left sat Jennifer Walsh, a recent graduate from Northwestern who brought fresh perspectives on digital marketing trends but sometimes struggled with the more traditional aspects of financial services marketing. To my right was Michael Torres, a 15-year veteran of the company who had encyclopedic knowledge of Davidson's history and client base, but seemed increasingly frustrated with the pace of digital transformation. The dynamic between Jennifer and Michael had become a microcosm of broader generational tensions within the company, tensions that were affecting the success of our digital initiatives in ways that weren't captured in the metrics we reviewed at the board level. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jennifer would propose innovative social media strategies that aligned perfectly with our digital transformation goals. But Michael would raise practical concerns about regulatory compliance or client communication preferences that had been developed through years of experience. Neither perspective was wrong, but finding effective synthesis required the kind of nuanced management that was difficult to mandate from the executive level. As I settled into my workstation that morning, I noticed that Michael seemed particularly stressed. His usual morning routine of carefully organizing his desk and reviewing the day's priorities replaced by anxious scrolling through emails and occasional glances toward the department manager's office. Jennifer was similarly distracted, her typically vibrant energy subdued as she mechanically sorted through campaign materials without her usual creative enthusiasm. I had learned that these subtle shifts in department mood often signaled important developments that wouldn't reach executive attention for weeks, if ever. The informal networks of communication, the casual conversations that happened during coffee breaks or while waiting for the elevator, carried information that was often more accurate and timely than formal reporting structures. As a marketing coordinator, I was part of these networks in ways that no amount of executive communication initiatives could replicate. "Good morning, Jennifer," I said, settling into my chair and powering up my computer. "You seem a bit distracted today. Everything okay?" She glanced up from the campaign materials she had been mechanically sorting, her expression revealing the kind of professional anxiety that every employee learns to manage but never quite eliminate. "Oh, hi, Sarah. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about the performance review cycle that's coming up. You know how it is." I did know how it was, though from a perspective she couldn't imagine. As chairman, I had been involved in designing the performance review system that was causing her anxiety. The system had been created with the best intentions, using industry best practices and extensive consultation with human resources experts. It was designed to be fair, comprehensive, and aligned with our company values. But experiencing it from the employee perspective revealed complexities that hadn't been apparent during the design phase. The performance review process required employees to document their achievements, identify areas for improvement, and set goals for the following year. It seemed straightforward from a policy perspective, but the implementation created significant stress for employees who worried about how to present their work in the most favorable light, how to acknowledge weaknesses without undermining their job security, and how to set goals that were ambitious enough to demonstrate commitment but realistic enough to achieve. Michael looked up from his email with a rueful smile. "Performance reviews are like tax audits," he said. "Even when you know you've done everything right, the process itself makes you question whether you've somehow missed something important." The comparison was more insightful than he probably realized. It highlighted how even well-intentioned organizational processes could create psychological burden that affected employee morale and productivity in ways that were difficult to measure but very real in their impact. "I have my review scheduled with Marcus this afternoon," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping slightly as she mentioned our department supervisor. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain the social media engagement metrics for the small business campaign. The numbers are good, but they're not great, and I'm not sure if that's because of the content strategy, the target audience selection, or just market timing." Her concern reflected one of the persistent challenges in modern performance management. As businesses became more data-driven, there was increasing pressure to quantify every aspect of performance, but many important contributions were difficult to measure or were influenced by factors beyond individual control. Jennifer's social media work was creative and strategic, requiring collaboration with multiple departments and adaptation to changing market conditions. Reducing that complexity to a simple set of metrics inevitably missed important nuances. "Have you talked to Marcus about the context for those numbers?" I asked, already knowing that such conversations were rare in our current review process. Sometimes the story behind the metrics is more important than the metrics themselves. Michael nodded emphatically. "That's exactly right, but Marcus isn't really interested in stories. He wants numbers he can put in reports that go upstairs. Everything has to fit into the categories that somebody in executive management created for measuring marketing effectiveness." The observation stung because it was accurate. I had been part of the executive team that created those measurement categories, and we had genuinely believed we were establishing clear, objective standards for evaluating marketing performance. But hearing Michael's perspective revealed how those standards could become constraints that prevented managers from recognizing the full scope of their employees' contributions. I spent the next several hours working on social media content for the small business lending campaign, a project that required coordination with our legal team to ensure compliance with financial services regulations, collaboration with the graphic design team to create visually appealing content, and ongoing communication with regional sales teams to ensure the messaging aligned with their client interactions. Each of these collaborations provided insight into different aspects of Davidson Financial's operations, revealing both strengths and opportunities for improvement that would never appear in executive dashboards or board reports. The legal review process, for example, was thorough and effective at ensuring compliance, but it also significantly slowed content development and sometimes resulted in messaging that was technically accurate but less engaging for potential clients. The legal team wasn't being unnecessarily bureaucratic. They were responding to regulatory requirements and protecting the company from potential liability. But the impact on marketing effectiveness was real, and finding better balance required understanding both perspectives in detail. Similarly, the graphic design team was talented and creative, but they were consistently overwhelmed with requests from multiple departments, leading to delayed deliverables and sometimes rushed work that didn't meet their usual standards. From an executive perspective, the solution might seem simple: hire more designers or outsource overflow work. But understanding the actual workflow revealed that the bottleneck wasn't just capacity, but also communication and priority management across departments. Around 11:30, I received a text message on my personal phone from Margaret Foster, Davidson Financial's Chief Operating Officer. Board call moved to 2 p.m. today. Strategic planning discussion about Q4 initiatives. Can you join from the Chicago office? The timing was challenging because it overlapped with my scheduled work on the lending campaign. But board responsibilities took priority, even when maintaining my cover required creative scheduling. I approached Jennifer's desk with what I hoped was casual concern. "I just got a call from my doctor's office," I said, manufacturing the kind of personal emergency that working professionals everywhere understood. "They had a cancellation and can fit me in for a follow-up appointment this afternoon. Would you be able to cover the campaign review meeting with the design team if I need to step out around 2? "Of course," she replied immediately, the kind of collegial support that made effective teamwork possible. "I hope everything's okay with your appointment." "Nothing serious," I assured her, feeling the familiar discomfort of deception even when it served a larger purpose. "Just routine follow-up. But you know how hard it is to get appointments that fit with work schedules." The small lie bothered me more than it should have, representing the ongoing ethical complexity of my dual existence. I was learning valuable information about Davidson Financial's operations and culture, information that would help me lead the company more effectively and ultimately benefit all employees. But that noble purpose didn't eliminate the daily deceptions required to maintain my cover. The constant awareness that my colleagues' trust was based on incomplete information about who I really was. At 1:45, I left the office through the main entrance, walking 2 blocks to a small coffee shop where I could take the board call privately. The establishment had become my regular spot for confidential conversations, offering reliable Wi-Fi and enough ambient noise to mask sensitive discussions, while maintaining the kind of casual atmosphere that wouldn't draw attention if colleagues happened to see me there. The board call focused on fourth-quarter strategic initiatives, particularly our expansion into sustainable investment products, and the proposed acquisition of a regional community bank that would strengthen our presence in underserved markets. The discussion was high-level and forward-thinking, the kind of strategic planning that required balancing multiple complex factors, including market trends, regulatory environment, competitive positioning, and organizational capacity. As chairman, I contributed to discussions about due diligence requirements for the acquisition, timeline considerations for the sustainable investment launch, and resource allocation across different growth initiatives. The conversation was intellectually stimulating and strategically important, but it also highlighted the contrast between executive planning and operational reality that I experienced daily in my coordinator role. For example, the Sustainable Investment Initiative required significant technology infrastructure upgrades and extensive employee training on new product features. From the board perspective, these seemed like straightforward implementation challenges that could be addressed through appropriate project management and resource allocation. But my experience with the CRM system rollout had shown how complex technology implementations became when they intersected with existing workflows, employee capabilities, and client communication requirements. The board call concluded at 3:15, giving me enough time to return to the office and rejoin the campaign development work without creating suspicion about my extended absence. As I walked back through downtown Chicago, I mentally transitioned from strategic planning mode back to tactical implementation focus, preparing to dive back into social media content development and design team coordination. When I returned to the marketing department, I found Jennifer in animated conversation with Michael about the design team meeting I had missed. Apparently, the graphic designers had raised concerns about the timeline for campaign materials, suggesting that the current schedule might not allow for the iterative review process that typically produced the best results. The concern was valid and represented exactly the kind of implementation detail that could significantly affect campaign success but might not surface until problems became obvious. "How did the design team meeting go?" I asked, settling back into my workstation. "Any major concerns about the timeline?" Jennifer's expression suggested mixed results. "They're worried about the review cycle," she explained. "Legal wants 3 rounds of review for compliance, which is normal, but marketing also wants creative input at each stage, and sales wants to test messaging with focus groups before final approval. When you add it all up, we might not have enough time for quality iteration." The challenge she described was emblematic of broader organizational complexity that was difficult to address through policy or process changes alone. Each department's requirements were reasonable within their domain of responsibility, but the cumulative effect created timeline pressure that forced compromises in quality or completeness. Solving such problems required understanding the detailed workflow and finding creative solutions that met everyone's core needs while eliminating redundancy or inefficiency. "What if we modified the review sequence?" I suggested, drawing on insights from both my coordinator experience and my executive perspective on project management. Instead of sequential reviews, we could do parallel review for the first round, with legal, marketing, and sales all providing input simultaneously on the initial concepts. Then we could have a collaborative session to resolve any conflicts before moving to the refinement stage. Michael looked thoughtful as he considered the proposal. "That could work," he agreed, "but it would require more coordination up front to make sure everyone understands the parameters for their review. Sometimes parallel review leads to contradictory feedback that's harder to reconcile than sequential review." His concern was well-founded and reflected the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of experience managing similar projects. Sequential review took longer but provided clearer decision-making authority and reduced the risk of conflicting feedback that could paralyze the creative process. Finding the right balance required understanding both the theoretical efficiency of parallel processes and the practical challenges of collaborative decision-making. The rest of the afternoon was spent developing content drafts and coordinating with various stakeholders about review timelines and feedback processes. The work was detailed and sometimes tedious, but it provided continuous insight into how organizational decisions affected daily operations. Every policy, every process, every strategic initiative eventually translated into specific tasks that real people had to complete, using available resources and existing capabilities. As 5:30 approached, I began organizing my materials and preparing to leave the office. My evening schedule included reviewing acquisition due diligence materials for tomorrow's board committee meeting, a task that required several hours of concentrated analysis in the privacy of my apartment. The transition between my roles had become routine, but it still required careful attention to ensure that information and insights flowed appropriately between my two identities without creating security risks or ethical conflicts. "See you tomorrow," Jennifer called as I gathered my things. "Thanks for covering with the design team. I hope your doctor's appointment went well." "Everything's fine," I assured her, maintaining the fiction while feeling the familiar discomfort of deception. "Have a good evening." As I left the Davidson Financial Building that evening, walking through the lobby where Robert was ending his shift and nodding goodbye, I reflected on the complex dual existence I had created. The marketing coordinator role had provided invaluable insights into organizational dynamics, employee experience, and the practical challenges of implementing executive decisions. But it had also created ethical complexities and personal isolation that were increasingly difficult to manage. The information I gained as Sarah Chen directly informed my decisions as Chairman Sarah Chen Martinez, helping me advocate for more realistic implementation timelines, better employee communication about strategic changes, and resource allocation that reflected actual operational requirements rather than theoretical projections. The company was stronger because of my unconventional approach to leadership development, but the personal cost was significant, and the deception was becoming increasingly elaborate. As I walked home through the Chicago evening, past restaurants where colleagues sometimes gathered after work, past shops where I occasionally encountered Davidson employees during lunch breaks, I wondered how much longer I could maintain this double life. The insights were valuable, but the isolation was growing, and the risk of discovery was constantly present. More importantly, I was beginning to question whether the information I was gathering could be obtained through more transparent means that didn't require ongoing deception of people who had come to trust and rely on me. Tomorrow would bring another day of balancing these competing responsibilities and identities, another day of being simultaneously the most informed and the most isolated person in the Davidson Financial Organization. The irony wasn't lost on me that in my effort to better understand and connect with our employees, I had created a situation where authentic connection was impossible because it was built on a foundation of carefully maintained fiction. The evening ahead would be spent reviewing acquisition materials and preparing for board discussions that would shape Davidson Financial's future, while tomorrow morning I would return to coordinating social media campaigns and collaborating with colleagues who saw me as a peer, rather than the person ultimately responsible for the strategic decisions that affected their professional lives. The duality was exhausting, enlightening, and increasingly unsustainable, but it had already provided insights that would influence my leadership approach for years to come. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted on a Tuesday morning in late October. I had just finished reviewing the quarterly financial statements for the board meeting scheduled later that day when Marcus Williams appeared at my cubicle, with an expression that suggested this conversation would be far from routine. His jaw was set in that particular way that middle managers adopt when they believe they've uncovered evidence of employee misconduct, and he carried a manila folder thick with what I assumed were documentation of my supposed infractions. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately," he announced, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that Jennifer and Michael would overhear without being overtly public about the confrontation. "Please gather your things and come to my office. Now." The other members of the marketing team exchanged glances that mixed curiosity with sympathy, the kind of looks that workplace veterans gave each other when someone was clearly about to face disciplinary action. I followed Marcus through the maze of cubicles and past the conference rooms where various teams were conducting their morning meetings, acutely aware that our procession was drawing attention from colleagues who had learned to recognize the body language of workplace drama. Marcus's office was a standard middle management space, featuring the requisite motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, a bookshelf lined with marketing textbooks and industry reports, and a desk arrangement that positioned him as the authority figure while relegating visitors to slightly lower chairs that subtly reinforced the power dynamic. He closed the door with deliberate care before moving to his desk and opening the manila folder with theatrical precision. The contents appeared to be a comprehensive compilation of attendance records, email logs, and what looked like surveillance reports about my daily activities. The level of documentation suggested that Marcus had been building this case for quite some time, treating my attendance patterns as a serious investigation rather than a routine management concern. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe in honest communication," he began, adopting the tone that managers use when they want to appear reasonable while delivering ultimatums. "Over the past 3 months, I've been tracking some concerning patterns in your work behavior that we need to address immediately." He spread several documents across his desk like evidence in a legal proceeding, each one carefully highlighted and annotated with his observations. "According to our keycard access logs, you've been arriving late or leaving early on 37 separate occasions since August 1st, he continued, pointing to a spreadsheet that tracked my building entry and exit times with obsessive precision. "Additionally, you've taken what you've described as medical appointments, family emergencies, or personal business on 43 different days during this same period. That represents nearly 70% of workdays where your attendance has been substandard." I listened to his presentation with growing amazement at the thoroughness of his investigation, while simultaneously calculating how to respond without revealing information that would compromise my actual position within the company. Marcus had clearly invested significant effort in documenting what he perceived as problematic behavior, creating charts and timelines that would have been impressive if they weren't so completely wrong about the underlying situation. "Furthermore," he continued, warming to his subject as he moved through his carefully prepared presentation, "I've received reports from other departments about missed meetings, delayed responses to collaborative requests, and general unavailability during normal business hours. The customer service team mentioned that you were unreachable for 2 hours last Thursday when they needed immediate input on a client communication issue. The customer service situation he referenced had occurred during a board committee meeting where we were discussing the acquisition of a smaller financial firm, a strategic decision that would ultimately create new opportunities for exactly the kind of client communication challenges he was describing. The irony of being criticized for attending a meeting where I was helping to shape the company's future direction while supposedly neglecting my responsibilities to address immediate operational issues was almost too absurd to process. Marcus paused his presentation to study my reaction, clearly expecting some combination of defensiveness, apology, or explanation that would confirm his assumptions about my unprofessional behavior. When I remained silent, simply listening to his concerns without immediate justification, his confidence seemed to waver slightly, as though my calm response didn't match the defensive reaction he had anticipated from someone caught in serious misconduct. "Now I want to be fair here," he continued, his tone softening slightly as he moved into what was clearly his prepared conclusion. "You've been a solid contributor when you're actually present, and your work quality has been consistently good. But attendance and availability are fundamental requirements for any position, especially in a collaborative environment like marketing, where your absence affects other people's ability to do their jobs effectively." He leaned forward across his desk, adopting what he probably considered a mentoring posture. "Sarah, I need to understand what's going on in your personal life that's creating these attendance issues. If there are health problems, family situations, or other challenges that we can accommodate through proper channels, I'm willing to work with you. But this pattern can't continue without formal documentation in your personnel file." The conversation had reached the point where I needed to provide some explanation that would satisfy Marcus's concerns, without revealing information that could compromise my board position or create security risks for the company. The challenge was finding a response that was truthful enough to maintain my personal integrity, while being vague enough to protect the larger deception that my dual role required. "Marcus, I appreciate your thoroughness in documenting these concerns," I began, choosing my words carefully, while maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well in both my marketing coordinator and board chairman roles. "You're absolutely right that consistent attendance and availability are important for team collaboration, and I understand how my schedule patterns might appear problematic from a management perspective." I paused to consider how much information I could safely share without creating additional complications. "There are some ongoing family business matters that require my attention during traditional business hours," I explained, which was technically accurate since Davidson Financial was indeed a family business and board responsibilities did require attention during business hours. "I've been trying to manage these obligations without affecting my work contributions, but I realize that the scheduling conflicts might not be as invisible as I had hoped." Marcus's expression suggested that my explanation was moving in the direction he had expected, confirming his assumption that personal issues were interfering with professional responsibilities. "What kind of family business matters?" he asked, his tone implying that he was prepared to be understanding if I provided sufficient detail to justify the accommodation he was considering. The question placed me in an impossible position. Providing specific details about my family business responsibilities would eventually lead to revelations about my actual role within Davidson Financial, but remaining vague would likely be interpreted as evasiveness or dishonesty. I needed to find a middle ground that satisfied Marcus's immediate concerns while preserving the operational security that my dual role required. Without going into details that might be inappropriate for a workplace discussion, I replied, "There are some legal and financial matters related to my family's investments that require periodic meetings with attorneys, accountants, and other professional advisors. These meetings often can't be scheduled outside of normal business hours because of the other party's availability constraints." This explanation was entirely truthful while being sufficiently vague to avoid immediate complications. Board meetings, investor calls, and strategic planning sessions did indeed require coordination with attorneys, accountants, and various professional advisors, and scheduling such meetings around the availability of multiple high-level executives often did require flexibility during traditional business hours. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting that my explanation fit within his understanding of reasonable personal circumstances that might require workplace accommodation. "I can understand how family financial matters might create scheduling challenges," he acknowledged, his tone becoming more collaborative and less confrontational. However, we need to establish a more formal arrangement that ensures your availability for essential team functions while accommodating these personal obligations. He reached for another document from his folder, this one appearing to be a proposed schedule modification that he had prepared in advance of our conversation. I've been thinking about potential solutions that might work for both your personal situation and our departmental needs, he continued, spreading the document between us so we could review it together. The proposed arrangement involved a modified work schedule that would allow me to work from home 2 days per week, with the understanding that I would be fully available for team meetings and collaborative projects on the days when I was physically present in the office. Additionally, Marcus suggested implementing a communication protocol that would ensure he was informed in advance about any scheduling conflicts that might affect team operations. This is actually a reasonable proposal, I admitted, genuinely impressed by the thoughtfulness of his solution despite the fundamental misunderstanding about my situation. The flexibility to work remotely would certainly help me manage the scheduling conflicts between my coordinator responsibilities and my board obligations. However, I would need some discretion about the specific timing of remote workdays, since family business matters don't always follow predictable schedules. Marcus seemed pleased that his proposed solution was being received positively, interpreting my acceptance as confirmation that he had correctly diagnosed the problem and developed an appropriate response. That's perfectly understandable, he agreed. We can build in flexibility for urgent family matters, as long as we maintain open communication about schedule changes that might affect team projects. As we continued discussing the practical details of this modified arrangement, I found myself genuinely appreciating Marcus's management approach, despite the awkward circumstances. He had identified what appeared to be a performance problem, investigated it thoroughly, and developed a collaborative solution that addressed both organizational needs and employee circumstances. The fact that his investigation had been based on incomplete information didn't diminish the quality of his problem-solving process. However, our conversation was interrupted by a knock on Marcus's office door, followed immediately by the entrance of Patricia Morrison, the regional vice president for Davidson Financial's Midwest operations. Patricia's unexpected appearance instantly elevated the stakes of our discussion, since her presence suggested that my attendance patterns had attracted attention from executive leadership levels far above Marcus's middle management position. Marcus, I apologize for interrupting, Patricia said, her professional demeanor carrying the kind of authority that immediately shifted the power dynamics in the room. I need to speak with both of you about some scheduling matters that have come to my attention. She glanced at me with an expression that seemed to combine recognition with something that might have been amusement, though her professional composure made it difficult to interpret her reaction with certainty. Patricia had been promoted to her current position 6 months earlier, around the time when I was beginning to establish my routine as Sarah Chen, the marketing coordinator. Our paths had crossed occasionally during board meetings and executive briefings, though always in my capacity as chairman rather than as a marketing department employee. Her sudden appearance in Marcus's office created the potential for exposure that I had been carefully avoiding throughout my time in the coordinator role. Of course, Patricia, Marcus replied, immediately deferring to her executive authority while clearly struggling to understand why a regional vice president would be personally involved in what he considered a routine employee attendance issue. We were just discussing some scheduling modifications that might help address Sarah's availability concerns. Patricia's smile carried subtle implications that made me increasingly nervous about the direction this conversation might take. I'm sure you were, she replied, her tone suggesting knowledge of information that hadn't been shared with Marcus. However, I think there may be some misunderstandings about Sarah's actual responsibilities and reporting relationships that we should clarify before implementing any scheduling modifications. The statement hung in the air like a bomb with a visible countdown timer, creating a moment of silence that felt interminable while Marcus processed the implications of Patricia's words. His expression cycled through confusion, realization, and something approaching panic as he began to understand that his carefully documented case against my attendance patterns might be based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about my role within the organization. Marcus, Patricia continued, her tone remaining professionally neutral while delivering information that would completely reframe his understanding of the situation, Sarah Chen isn't just a marketing coordinator whose attendance patterns need management oversight. She's actually been conducting special projects that require coordination with executive leadership, including responsibilities that occasionally take her away from routine departmental activities. This explanation was technically accurate, while being diplomatically vague about the specific nature of my special projects and executive coordination responsibilities. Patricia was providing Marcus with a face-saving interpretation of events that would allow him to retreat from his disciplinary approach without feeling completely undermined or humiliated by the revelation of his mistake. I could see Marcus struggling to process this new information while maintaining his professional composure, his mind clearly racing through the implications of having spent weeks documenting the supposedly problematic behavior of someone who was apparently operating under different authority and responsibility structures than he had understood. The careful case he had built against my attendance patterns was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by the mortifying realization that he had been criticizing behavior that was actually authorized at levels far above his management authority. Special projects, he repeated slowly, his voice reflecting the cognitive dissonance of having his understanding of organizational hierarchy suddenly reorganized. What kind of special projects require this level of schedule flexibility? The question was directed at Patricia rather than me, indicating his recognition that explanations needed to come from executive authority rather than from someone he had been treating as a subordinate employee. Patricia glanced at me briefly before responding, her expression suggesting that she was choosing her words carefully to provide necessary clarification without revealing more information than was appropriate for Marcus's level within the organization. Sarah has been working on strategic analysis projects that require coordination with various departments and external stakeholders, she explained, using language that was accurate without being specific. These projects often involve meeting schedules that don't align with traditional office hours, which explains the attendance patterns you've been observing. The explanation was diplomatic and professionally appropriate, providing Marcus with enough information to understand that his concerns had been misplaced, without revealing details that could compromise operational security or create additional complications. I remained silent during this exchange, recognizing that Patricia was managing the situation more effectively than any explanation I could have provided while maintaining my coordinator cover. Marcus's expression reflected the complex emotions of someone discovering that their careful analysis had been based on incomplete information, a mixture of embarrassment, relief, and professional concern about having potentially overstepped boundaries with someone whose actual organizational position was apparently quite different from what he had understood. I see, he said slowly, clearly processing the implications of this new information for both our immediate conversation and his broader understanding of departmental operations. Patricia seemed to recognize his discomfort and moved to provide reassurance that would help him navigate this unexpected revelation without feeling completely undermined in his management authority. Marcus, you handled this situation exactly as you should have, she assured him, her tone acknowledging his professional competence while gently correcting his understanding of the circumstances. Attendance monitoring is an important supervisory responsibility, and your thoroughness in documenting concerns demonstrates exactly the kind of management attention we want to see. She paused briefly before continuing, her words carefully chosen to provide guidance for future similar situations. In cases where attendance patterns might be related to special projects or executive coordination, it's always appropriate to raise concerns through proper channels. The fact that this particular situation involved responsibilities outside normal departmental scope doesn't diminish the value of your supervisory diligence. Marcus nodded gratefully at Patricia's diplomatic handling of his predicament, visibly relieved that his management approach was being validated, even though his understanding of the specific circumstances had been incorrect. I appreciate that clarification, he replied, his professional composure returning as he processed the new framework for understanding the situation. Should I modify my attendance monitoring procedures for special project assignments, or continue with standard documentation? That's an excellent question, Patricia responded, her appreciation for his professional approach evident in her tone. For any employee whose schedule involves coordination with executive leadership or external stakeholders, I'd recommend checking with my office before implementing formal attendance interventions. We can provide guidance about whether schedule patterns are related to authorized activities or represent legitimate supervisory concerns. The conversation continued for several more minutes. with Patricia providing Marcus with broader context about special projects and executive coordination responsibilities that would help him navigate similar situations in the future. Throughout this discussion, I remained largely silent, contributing only when directly addressed and maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well in both my coordinator and board roles. As our meeting concluded, Marcus seemed to have processed the new information and adjusted his understanding of the situation appropriately. "Sarah, I apologize if my attendance monitoring created any difficulties for your project responsibilities," he said, his tone reflecting genuine professionalism despite the awkward circumstances. "In the future, I'll coordinate with Patricia's office before addressing schedule concerns that might be related to special assignments." "No apology necessary," I assured him, genuinely appreciating his professional handling of a complex situation. "Your attention to departmental attendance patterns is exactly the kind of supervisory responsibility that helps ensure team effectiveness. I understand that my schedule flexibility might create coordination challenges, and I'm happy to work with you on communication protocols that address operational needs while accommodating project requirements." Patricia's intervention had successfully diffused the immediate crisis, while providing Marcus with enough information to understand that his concerns had been based on incomplete knowledge rather than actual performance problems. However, the conversation had also elevated awareness of my dual role to additional people within the organization, creating potential security risks that would need careful management going forward. As we left Marcus's office, Patricia walked with me toward the elevator banks, her professional demeanor suggesting that our conversation would continue privately once we were away from the marketing department's potential observation. The elevator ride to the executive floors provided the first opportunity for confidential discussion about the implications of the morning's events and the potential complications they might create for my ongoing dual-role strategy. The executive floor, where Patricia's office was located, represented a completely different organizational environment from the marketing department where I had been working as Sarah Chen, the coordinator. Here, the decor was more sophisticated, the pace more measured, and the conversations more focused on strategic issues rather than tactical implementation details. Moving between these environments daily had given me unique perspective on how different organizational levels experienced the same company, but it had also required constant attention to appropriate behavior and communication for each context. Patricia's office commanded impressive views of Chicago's downtown area, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided natural light and a sense of elevation that reinforced the executive authority her position represented. As she closed the door and gestured for me to take a seat in the comfortable chair arrangement near the windows, her professional demeanor relaxed slightly, suggesting that we could now discuss the morning's events more candidly. "That was an interesting situation to navigate," she observed, her tone carrying implications that suggested she understood more about my dual role than had been apparent during the conversation with Marcus. Marcus is a competent manager who was responding appropriately to what appeared to be a legitimate performance concern. The challenge, of course, is that your actual responsibilities create attendance patterns that don't fit standard supervisory expectations. I appreciated her diplomatic handling of the situation, I replied, recognizing that she had managed the conversations skillfully while protecting both Marcus's professional dignity and my operational security. "The explanation you provided was accurate without revealing information that could create additional complications. However, I'm concerned that this incident suggests my dual-role strategy may be becoming unsustainable." Patricia nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting the complex considerations involved in managing unconventional leadership development approaches within established organizational structures. "The benefits of your coordinator role and understanding operational realities have been significant," she acknowledged, "but maintaining the deception is becoming increasingly challenging as your board responsibilities expand and require more frequent schedule modifications." She moved to her desk and retrieved a folder that appeared to contain information related to my dual-role arrangement, suggesting that she had been monitoring the situation and considering potential adjustments to ensure continued operational effectiveness. "The quarterly board meeting calendar for next year shows increased frequency of committee meetings and strategic planning sessions," she noted, reviewing documents that outlined my expanding chairman responsibilities. Additionally, the acquisition discussions and digital transformation initiatives will require more extensive executive coordination that will be difficult to disguise as medical appointments or family emergencies. The practical challenges she outlined reflected concerns I had been considering myself as my board responsibilities evolved and expanded. The insights I was gaining from the coordinator role remained valuable, but the logistical complexity of maintaining two distinct professional identities was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, without creating security risks or compromising my effectiveness in either role. What options are you considering for transitioning away from the coordinator position? Patricia asked, her question suggesting that she had been thinking strategically about how to preserve the benefits of my dual role experience while addressing the growing practical complications. The knowledge you've gained about operational realities and employee perspectives has already influenced several important board decisions, but we need to consider how to capture those insights in a more sustainable framework. I had been wrestling with this question myself, recognizing that the coordinator role had served its intended purpose of providing ground-level insights into organizational dynamics, but that continuing the deception indefinitely would eventually create more problems than benefits. The information I've gathered over the past 18 months has fundamentally changed my understanding of how board decisions affect daily operations, I explained, thinking through the various strategic considerations involved in transitioning away from my dual role. The challenge is finding ways to maintain that connection to operational reality, without requiring ongoing deception of colleagues who have come to trust the identity I've created as Sarah Chen, the coordinator. I've developed genuine working relationships with people like Jennifer and Michael, and the prospect of revealing that those relationships were based on incomplete information about my actual identity creates significant ethical concerns. Patricia's expression reflected understanding of the complex personal and professional considerations involved in managing my transition away from the coordinator role. Those relationships represent exactly the kind of authentic connection between executive leadership and operational employees that the dual role strategy was designed to create, she observed. The challenge is finding ways to preserve those insights and connections while transitioning to a more sustainable leadership approach. She paused to consider the various options available for managing this transition effectively. One possibility would be to gradually transition the Sarah Chen coordinator role into a consulting or special projects position that would provide legitimate justification for the schedule flexibility you've been maintaining, she suggested. This would allow you to step back from daily marketing activities while preserving relationships and avoiding the need for dramatic revelations about your actual identity. Another option would be to use the insights you've gained to advocate for expanded communication and feedback mechanisms that would provide ongoing connection between executive leadership and operational employees, without requiring personal deception. Anonymous feedback systems, regular town hall meetings, and rotational leadership assignments could potentially provide similar insights through more transparent means. As we discussed these various transition strategies, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of my dual role experience for organizational leadership and employee engagement. The coordinator position had revealed significant gaps between executive perceptions and operational reality, gaps that affected everything from policy implementation to employee satisfaction to strategic planning effectiveness. For example, the digital transformation initiative that had been a major board priority looked quite different from the marketing coordinator perspective. While the executive narrative focused on improved efficiency and enhanced capability, the daily reality involved significant learning curves, workflow disruptions, and employee frustration that weren't being captured in the metrics we reviewed at the board level. Similarly, performance review processes that seemed fair and comprehensive from a policy perspective created significant stress and uncertainty for employees who worried about how to present their contributions effectively within predetermined categories that didn't always capture the full scope of their work contributions. These insights had already influenced several board decisions, leading to more realistic implementation timelines, improved employee communication about strategic changes, and resource allocation that reflected actual operational requirements rather than theoretical projections. However, the question remained about how to institutionalize these insights and maintain ongoing connection to operational reality without requiring the complex deception that my dual role had necessitated. Patricia's suggestion about expanded communication and feedback mechanisms had merit, but my experience suggested that formal systems often failed to capture the nuanced information that emerged through authentic daily interactions with colleagues who saw me as a peer rather than as executive authority. The informal conversations during coffee breaks, the casual observations about workflow challenges, and the candid discussions about management effectiveness provided insights that were unlikely to emerge through structured feedback processes where employees knew their comments would be reviewed by executive leadership. As our conversation continued, Patricia raised another important consideration about the potential risks of maintaining my dual role arrangement indefinitely. Beyond the logistical challenges of managing conflicting schedules and the ethical concerns about ongoing deception, there were also security considerations related to confidential information and potential conflicts of interest that could arise as my board responsibilities expanded. The acquisition discussions currently underway involved confidential information about potential target companies, due diligence findings, and strategic considerations that could create significant legal and financial liabilities if inadvertently disclosed through my coordinator role activities. Similarly, executive compensation decisions, performance evaluations of senior management, and strategic planning initiatives required absolute confidentiality that became increasingly difficult to maintain while participating in daily workplace conversations as a peer employee. These security considerations provided additional motivation for developing a transition strategy that would preserve the benefits of my operational insights while eliminating the risks associated with maintaining two distinct professional identities within the same organization. The challenge was finding an approach that honored the authentic relationships I had developed while managing the revelation of my actual role in a way that maintained trust and professional integrity. Our discussion was interrupted by Patricia's assistant, announcing that she had a conference call scheduled with the executive leadership team to discuss quarterly performance metrics. As we concluded our conversation, Patricia emphasized the importance of developing a definitive transition plan within the next few weeks. Recognizing that the current arrangement was becoming increasingly unsustainable, as my board responsibilities expanded and my coordinator role attracted more attention from supervisory management, I returned to the marketing department with a complex mixture of relief and apprehension, grateful that Patricia's intervention had resolved the immediate crisis with Marcus, while recognizing that the incident had highlighted the growing fragility of my dual role strategy. The morning's events had brought me closer to discovery than I had ever been, and the conversation with Patricia had confirmed that transition planning could no longer be postponed indefinitely. As I settled back into my coordinator workstation, Jennifer and Michael both approached with expressions of curiosity and concern about my meeting with Marcus and subsequent departure with Patricia Morrison. Their questions reflected the natural workplace interest in understanding what had happened to a colleague who had been called away for what appeared to be serious discussions with management authority. "Is everything okay?" Jennifer asked, her tone reflecting genuine concern about my well-being rather than mere curiosity about workplace drama. "Marcus seemed pretty serious when he called you into his office, and then Patricia Morrison showing up seemed to escalate things to a whole different level." "Everything's fine," I assured her, providing the kind of vague reassurance that working professionals use to signal that confidential discussions are involved. "There were just some scheduling coordination issues that needed clarification with executive leadership. Nothing that affects my day-to-day work with the marketing team." Michael nodded understandingly, his years of corporate experience having taught him to recognize situations where detailed explanations wouldn't be appropriate or forthcoming. "Executive coordination can get complicated when multiple priorities overlap," he observed, his comments suggesting awareness that organizational complexity often created scheduling challenges that required management attention to resolve effectively. Their acceptance of my explanation without pressing for additional details reflected the professional courtesy that characterized most workplace relationships, but it also highlighted the trust that had developed between us over the months of working together on various marketing projects. This trust made the prospect of eventually revealing my actual identity even more complicated, since it would require acknowledging that our entire professional relationship had been based on incomplete information about who I really was. The rest of the day proceeded with relative normalcy, though I found myself more conscious than usual of the complex balance required to maintain my dual identity while fulfilling responsibilities in both roles. The marketing campaign development work continued with its familiar rhythm of collaborative meetings, creative reviews, and logistical coordination, but the morning's events had highlighted how precarious this elaborate deception had become. As evening approached and I prepared to transition back to my board chairman responsibilities for an acquisition planning call, I reflected on the growing recognition that my dual role experiment would soon need to conclude. The insights I had gained were invaluable, and had already influenced important strategic decisions, but the practical and ethical complexities of maintaining two distinct professional identities within the same organization had reached a point where continued deception was becoming more harmful than beneficial. The question was no longer whether to transition away from the coordinator role, but how to manage that transition in a way that preserved the valuable insights and authentic relationships, while maintaining the trust and professional integrity that effective leadership required. This challenge would define the next phase of my unconventional leadership development journey, requiring the same careful planning and strategic thinking that had characterized my initial decision to create the Sarah Chen coordinator identity. The crisis that would ultimately expose everything began with a seemingly routine email on a frigid December morning. I was reviewing quarterly performance metrics in my penthouse apartment, preparing for a board meeting later that day, when my secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from our Chief Financial Officer, Thomas Bradley. Emergency board meeting called for 2 p.m. today. Hostile takeover attempt by Meridian Capital. Need immediate strategic response. All board members required to attend in person. The message sent adrenaline coursing through my system as I absorbed the implications. Meridian Capital was a private equity firm known for aggressive acquisition strategies, particularly targeting mid-sized financial institutions like Davidson that showed strong growth potential but might be vulnerable to hostile approaches. If they had initiated a takeover attempt, it meant our stock price and market position had attracted predatory attention that could threaten the independence and values-driven approach that had defined Davidson Financial for 3 generations. I immediately began calculating the logistical challenges of attending an emergency board meeting while maintaining my coordinator cover at the office. The marketing department had a crucial campaign presentation scheduled for 3 o'clock, one where my absence would be particularly conspicuous since I had been coordinating the social media components with external agencies for the past 2 weeks. Missing such a visible commitment without advance notice would certainly raise questions that could lead to the kind of scrutiny I had been carefully avoiding. My first instinct was to manufacture another medical emergency, the cover story that had served me well for previous scheduling conflicts. However, Patricia Morrison's warning about the unsustainability of my dual-role arrangement echoed in my mind as I considered how many such emergencies my colleagues could reasonably believe before suspicions arose. Jennifer and Michael had already expressed subtle concern about my apparent health issues, their professional courtesy preventing direct questions but their observant eyes noting patterns that suggested ongoing problems. The magnitude of the corporate crisis facing Davidson Financial made these concerns about maintaining my cover seem almost trivial by comparison. A hostile takeover attempt represented an existential threat to the company's independence, its employee culture, and the community-focused financial services approach that had been my father's legacy. Every hour that passed without coordinated board response strengthened Meridian's position and reduced our strategic options for mounting an effective defense. I grabbed my secure laptop and began reviewing overnight trading activity for Davidson's stock, looking for signs of the unusual volume or price movements that typically preceded hostile takeover announcements. The data confirmed my worst fears. Trading volume had spiked dramatically in the past 48 hours, with several large block purchases that suggested coordinated acquisition activity. Meridian had clearly been accumulating Davidson shares through multiple entities, building a substantial position before announcing their intentions. The stock price had risen nearly 15% over the past week, reflecting market speculation about potential acquisition activity. While this increase might seem positive from a shareholder value perspective, it also indicated that word of Meridian's interest had leaked to the broader investment community, creating time pressure for our board response. Once takeover speculation became public, the dynamics shifted dramatically in favor of the acquirer, who could leverage market momentum and shareholder greed to overcome management resistance. I needed to be in that boardroom, providing strategic leadership during the most critical challenge Davidson Financial had faced since its founding. The coordinator role that had provided valuable operational insights suddenly seemed like an elaborate distraction from my fundamental responsibility to protect the company's independence and preserve the employment security of thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on Davidson's continued success as an independent institution. However, abandoning my coordinator position without explanation would create its own complications. potentially drawing attention to my dual identity at precisely the moment when corporate security and confidentiality were most critical. The last thing Davidson needed during a hostile takeover defense was internal disruption caused by revelations about unconventional leadership arrangements that could be misinterpreted by employees, shareholders, or the financial media covering the acquisition attempt. I decided to take a calculated risk, one that acknowledged the reality that maintaining my dual identity was becoming impossible under current circumstances while attempting to preserve operational security until the immediate crisis passed. I called Marcus directly, knowing that a phone conversation would allow me to control information more effectively than email or text communication that could be forwarded or misinterpreted. "Marcus, this is Sarah," I began when he answered, my voice carrying urgency that I hoped would discourage detailed questions. "I have a family emergency that requires my immediate attention today. I won't be able to make the campaign presentation this afternoon, and I may need several days to resolve the situation." The pause on Marcus's end suggested he was processing this information while remembering Patricia Morrison's earlier explanation about my special project responsibilities and executive coordination requirements. "A family emergency," he repeated slowly, his tone suggesting concern rather than suspicion. "Is this related to the family business matters you mentioned during our previous conversation?" "Yes, exactly," I confirmed, grateful that he had provided a framework for understanding my absence that aligned with previous explanations. "There's been an urgent development that requires my personal attention and can't be delegated to other family members or professional advisors." Marcus's response reflected the professional maturity that had impressed me during our earlier confrontation about attendance patterns. "Of course, Sarah. Family emergencies take priority over work commitments. Don't worry about the campaign presentation. I'll handle it personally and brief you on any developments when you return." His willingness to assume additional responsibilities without complaint or detailed questions demonstrated exactly the kind of management capability that made Davidson Financial's operational culture strong enough to resist hostile acquisition attempts. Employees like Marcus, Jennifer, and Michael represented institutional knowledge and cultural continuity that couldn't be replicated through corporate restructuring or private equity optimization strategies. "I appreciate your understanding," I told him sincerely, recognizing that his professional courtesy was enabling me to fulfill my board responsibilities during a critical moment for the company's future. "I'll keep you updated about my availability as the situation develops." After ending the call with Marcus, I quickly prepared for the emergency board meeting, while simultaneously organizing my affairs as Sarah Chen, the coordinator, to minimize disruption during what could be an extended absence. The campaign materials needed to be accessible to Marcus and the team, client communications required appropriate handoff procedures, and ongoing projects needed clear status documentation that would allow other team members to maintain continuity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially conducting succession planning for my own position, while preparing to defend the company against an acquisition attempt that would likely result in significant layoffs and organizational restructuring if successful. The coordinator role that had seemed like an elaborate leadership development exercise had become a genuine responsibility to real people, whose professional lives would be affected by both my departure and the broader corporate crisis facing Davidson Financial. I arrived at Davidson's executive headquarters in Manhattan 2 hours before the scheduled board meeting, using the additional time to review Meridian Capital's recent acquisition history and strategic approach. Their pattern was disturbingly consistent: acquire mid-sized financial institutions at premium prices, implement aggressive cost-cutting measures that typically included substantial layoffs, then either operate the companies as profit centers or resell them to larger institutions within 3 to 5 years. The human cost of Meridian's business model was evident in the track record of their previous acquisitions. Employee satisfaction scores consistently declined following their takeovers. Community reinvestment programs were typically eliminated as unnecessary expenses, and customer service quality deteriorated as staffing levels were reduced to maximize profitability. These outcomes represented everything that Davidson Financial had been built to avoid: the kind of short-term profit maximization that sacrificed long-term relationships and community impact for immediate shareholder returns. Thomas Bradley greeted me in the executive conference room with the kind of grim determination that financial professionals adopt during crisis situations. "Sarah, thank you for getting here so quickly," he said, his use of my first name reflecting the informal communication style that characterized Davidson's leadership culture during high-stress situations. "We've got a serious fight ahead of us, and we need every board member fully engaged if we're going to preserve the company's independence." The conference room had been transformed into a war room, with multiple monitors displaying real-time stock trading data, financial analysts' reports about the acquisition speculation, and strategic documents outlining potential defense measures. The atmosphere combined intense focus with underlying anxiety, as board members and senior executives grappled with the reality that Davidson's independence was under immediate threat from a well-funded and experienced corporate predator. Margaret Foster, our Chief Operating Officer, was coordinating with our investment banking advisors via conference call, discussing the legal and financial mechanisms available for resisting hostile takeover attempts. Eleanor Winters, the company founder who had retired from active management but retained board membership, sat at the head of the table with the kind of steely resolve that had built Davidson Financial from a small community bank into a regional powerhouse over 4 decades. As board members continued arriving for the emergency meeting, I found myself simultaneously energized by the strategic challenge and deeply concerned about the implications for the thousands of Davidson employees whose jobs and livelihoods hung in the balance. The coordinator role had given me intimate knowledge of how corporate decisions affected real people's daily lives, making the stakes of this acquisition battle feel intensely personal rather than merely strategic. The meeting began with Thomas Bradley presenting a comprehensive analysis of Meridian's position and probable strategy. "They've accumulated approximately 18% of our outstanding shares through various entities over the past 6 weeks, he reported, displaying charts that showed the systematic nature of their acquisition campaign. "Based on SEC filings and trading patterns, we estimate they're prepared to launch a formal tender offer at $42 per share, representing a 28% premium over yesterday's closing price. The premium was substantial enough to attract significant shareholder interest, particularly from institutional investors who might be more concerned with short-term returns than long-term corporate culture and community impact. However, the board's fiduciary responsibility required us to evaluate any acquisition offer based on its merits for all stakeholders, including employees, customers, and the communities Davidson served, not just immediate shareholder value." Eleanor Winters leaned forward with the kind of focused intensity that had characterized her leadership style throughout Davidson's growth trajectory. "What are our defensive options?" she asked, her question directed at the investment banking advisors who had been retained to provide strategic guidance during the crisis. "I want to understand every tool available for protecting this company's independence and preserving the employment security of our workforce." The lead advisor, Jonathan Mitchell from Goldman Sachs, outlined several potential defense strategies, each with distinct advantages and risks that would need careful evaluation. A poison pill plan could make hostile acquisition prohibitively expensive by diluting Meridian's ownership percentage, but such measures were often viewed negatively by shareholders and could face legal challenges that would consume valuable time and resources. Alternative approaches included seeking a white knight acquirer who might offer better terms and cultural alignment, implementing accelerated growth strategies that would increase Davidson's valuation beyond Meridian's acquisition capacity, or pursuing legal challenges to Meridian's acquisition methods if any regulatory violations could be identified. Each strategy required immediate implementation to be effective, as delay would only strengthen Meridian's position and reduce Davidson's strategic options. As the discussion continued, I found myself drawing on insights from my coordinator experience to evaluate the practical implications of different defense strategies. The poison pill approach, while financially sophisticated, would likely create significant anxiety among Davidson employees, who might interpret such measures as management entrenchment rather than genuine protection of corporate independence and job security. Similarly, seeking a white knight acquirer would still result in loss of independence, even if the cultural impact might be less severe than a Meridian takeover. The accelerated growth strategy appealed to me because it aligned with Davidson's historical approach of building long-term value through operational excellence rather than financial engineering. But it also required execution capabilities that might be difficult to achieve while simultaneously defending against hostile acquisition. After 2 hours of intensive strategic discussion, the board reached consensus on a multi-pronged defense strategy that combined immediate tactical measures with longer-term positioning for sustainable independence. The poison pill plan would be implemented as a short-term deterrent, while Davidson pursued accelerated growth through strategic acquisitions of smaller community banks that would increase our scale and market position. Additionally, we would launch an aggressive communication campaign to Davidson employees, customers, and community stakeholders, emphasizing the company's commitment to maintaining its community-focused approach and highlighting the negative consequences that typically followed private equity takeovers of financial institutions. This communication strategy would leverage Davidson's strong community relationships and employee loyalty as assets in the battle for independence. My role as chairman would be crucial in executing this communication strategy, since my visibility and credibility with various stakeholder groups could help rally support for maintaining Davidson's independence. However, this increased public role would make continuing my coordinator position impossible, as the media attention and executive responsibilities would inevitably expose my dual identity. As the board meeting concluded with assignments for implementing our defense strategy, Eleanor Winters approached me privately with the kind of direct communication style that had always characterized our professional relationship. "Sarah, the next few weeks will require your complete attention and availability as chairman," she observed, her tone suggesting awareness of potential complications I hadn't directly discussed with her. "I trust that any other commitments you might have can be appropriately managed during this critical period." Her carefully phrased comment indicated understanding that my recent attendance patterns and scheduling flexibility might be related to responsibilities or commitments that would need adjustment during the takeover defense. While she didn't specifically reference my coordinator role, her observations suggested that maintaining dual professional identities would be impossible during the intensive period ahead. "Absolutely," I assured her, recognizing that the time had come to make definitive choices about how to conclude my coordinator role while preserving the relationships and insights I had developed. The company's independence and employee security take absolute priority over any other considerations. Eleanor nodded with satisfaction, her expression reflecting confidence in my commitment, while acknowledging the complex personal and professional adjustments that crisis leadership often required. "Good. Davidson Financial has survived and thrived for 4 decades because we've never lost sight of our fundamental responsibility to the people who depend on our success. This situation will test that commitment like nothing we've faced before." As I left Davidson's Manhattan headquarters that evening, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever before. The next few weeks would determine whether Davidson Financial could maintain its independence and preserve the employment security of thousands of people, including the colleagues in the marketing department who knew me as Sarah Chen, the coordinator, rather than Sarah Chen Martinez, the chairman, fighting for their professional survival. The ride back to Chicago provided time for reflection about how to manage the transition away from my dual identity while maintaining focus on the existential challenge facing Davidson Financial. The coordinator role had served its purpose of providing operational insights that would inform my leadership during this crisis, but continuing the deception was no longer feasible given the public visibility that takeover defense would require. Upon returning to my penthouse apartment, I found several missed calls from Jennifer Walsh, her voicemails reflecting growing concern about my sudden absence from the campaign presentation, and the team's worry about what she described as a family emergency that sounded quite serious based on my conversation with Marcus. Her messages carried genuine personal concern rather than mere professional inconvenience, highlighting the authentic relationships that had developed despite the deceptive foundation of my coordinator identity. I also had text messages from Michael Torres, who had taken initiative to coordinate with the external advertising agency about campaign modifications needed to accommodate my absence. His proactive problem-solving and willingness to assume additional responsibilities without complaint demonstrated exactly the kind of employee dedication and capability that made Davidson Financial worth defending against hostile acquisition. These communications from my marketing department colleagues reinforced my determination to protect Davidson's independence and preserve their employment security, while simultaneously highlighting the complexity of eventually revealing my actual identity and role within the company. Jennifer and Michael had come to trust and rely on Sarah Chen, the coordinator, and discovering that person was actually the chairman responsible for strategic decisions affecting their professional lives would require careful management to preserve relationships and maintain team effectiveness. As I prepared for what would likely be weeks of intensive takeover defense activities, I realized that my dual identity experiment was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The insights gained from the coordinator role would inform my leadership during this critical period, but the public visibility required for effective stakeover defense made continuing the deception impossible. The question was no longer whether to reveal my actual identity, but when and how to manage that revelation in a way that preserved trust, maintained operational effectiveness, and honored the authentic relationships that had developed with colleagues who deserved honesty about who they had been working alongside for the past 18 months. Tomorrow would bring another day of intensive board meetings, strategic planning sessions, and stakeholder communications, as Davidson Financial mounted its defense against Meridian Capital's hostile takeover attempt. But it would also likely be one of the last days when I could maintain the fiction of being Sarah Chen, the marketing coordinator, rather than Sarah Chen Martinez, the chairman fighting to preserve the company's independence and protect thousands of jobs. The irony was profound. Just as my coordinator role had provided the deepest insights into what made Davidson Financial worth preserving, maintaining that role had become impossible precisely because those insights were now needed for the company's survival. The dual identity that had been created to understand operational reality would soon need to be dissolved, so that executive authority could be fully engaged in protecting that reality from destruction. I spent the evening reviewing takeover defense strategies and stakeholder communication plans, but found my thoughts repeatedly returning to conversations with Jennifer, Michael, Marcus, and other Davidson employees, whose trust I had earned under false pretenses, but whose professional security I was now committed to protecting with complete authenticity. The contradiction was unsettling but unavoidable, a reminder that leadership sometimes required uncomfortable choices between competing values and responsibilities. The morning would bring new challenges in the battle for Davidson's independence, but it would also bring the beginning of the end for my elaborate deception. The time had come to choose between maintaining my cover and fulfilling my responsibility as chairman during the most critical challenge the company had ever faced. The choice was obvious, but the personal and professional consequences would require careful navigation to preserve the trust and relationships that had made the coordinator role valuable in the first place. As I finally prepared for bed, my secure phone buzzed with another message from Thomas Bradley, containing preliminary legal analysis of Meridian's SEC filings and potential regulatory challenges to their acquisition methods. The technical details were complex, but the underlying message was clear. Davidson Financial had tools available for fighting the hostile takeover, but success would require sustained effort, strategic coordination, and complete commitment from board leadership. I responded with a brief acknowledgement while mentally preparing for the intensive period ahead. Whatever personal complications arose from revealing my dual identity, they were secondary to the fundamental responsibility of protecting Davidson Financial's independence and preserving the livelihoods of employees who had trusted the company with their professional security. The coordinator role had taught me that leadership wasn't just about making strategic decisions in boardrooms, but about understanding how those decisions affected real people's daily lives and professional aspirations. Now that understanding would be tested through the ultimate leadership challenge, defending the company's independence against a hostile acquirer who saw Davidson's employees and community relationships as inefficiencies to be eliminated, rather than assets to be preserved. Tomorrow would begin the final chapter of my dual identity experiment and the first chapter of a takeover defense that would determine Davidson Financial's future. The two narratives were converging toward a climax that would require everything I had learned about leadership, authenticity, and the complex relationship between strategic vision and operational reality. The stakes couldn't be higher, both for the company and for the authentic relationships I had built under circumstances that were about to be completely transformed. The moment of truth arrived when I least expected it. 3 weeks into our defense against Meridian's hostile takeover, I was rushing through Davidson's Chicago office lobby toward the elevator, my arms full of confidential board documents, when I heard Jennifer's voice calling my name from across the marble expanse. "Sarah? Wait up!" She jogged toward me, slightly out of breath, her expression mixing relief with confusion. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Marcus said you had a family emergency, but your phone goes straight to voicemail, and nobody seems to know when you'll be back." My heart stopped. In my haste to reach the emergency board meeting upstairs, I had forgotten that Sarah Chen, the coordinator, wasn't supposed to have building access to the executive floors. The keycard in my hand would open doors that should have been completely beyond a marketing coordinator's security clearance. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its doors sliding open to reveal Patricia Morrison and two other executives deep in conversation about acquisition defense strategies. Their discussion halted abruptly when they saw me, their expressions shifting from surprise to something approaching panic as they realized the delicate situation unfolding in the lobby. Jennifer's eyes moved from my face to the executive elevator, then to the confidential documents bearing Davidson Financial Group letterhead, and finally to Patricia's knowing expression. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. "You're not really a marketing coordinator, are you?" Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper, her face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and dawning understanding. The family emergency, the mysterious meetings, the schedule conflicts that never made sense. "You're actually—" "I am Sarah Chen Martinez, chairman of the board of directors for Davidson Financial Group," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "And yes, I've been working as a marketing coordinator for the past 18 months. The lobby seemed to freeze around us. Patricia stepped out of the elevator, her diplomatic training kicking in as she assessed how to manage this unexpected revelation. Jennifer stared at me as though I had transformed into a completely different person, which in many ways I had. But why? Jennifer's question carried the weight of betrayal, confusion, and professional disorientation. Why would the chairman of the board pretend to be a coordinator? Was this some kind of corporate espionage? Are you evaluating us for layoffs? Her fear was immediate and visceral, the kind of terror that employees experience when they discover that their workplace relationships aren't what they seemed. I could see her mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had, every casual comment about management, every moment of professional vulnerability she had shared with someone she thought was a peer. "Nothing you've said or done has put your job at risk," I assured her immediately, recognizing that job security was her primary concern. I took the coordinator position to understand how our executive decisions actually affect daily operations. Everything I learned has made me a better leader and advocate for employee interests. Jennifer's expression remained skeptical, her trust understandably shattered by the revelation that 18 months of professional friendship had been built on deception. "So when we complained about the new performance review system, you were actually the person who could have changed it? When Michael stressed about meeting unrealistic deadlines, you were part of the executive team that set those deadlines?" "Yes," I admitted, feeling the full weight of my ethical compromise. But those conversations directly influenced board decisions. The performance review modifications we implemented last quarter came from understanding employee concerns that I never would have learned about through formal feedback channels. Patricia stepped forward with diplomatic intervention. "Jennifer, I understand this is shocking, but Sarah's unconventional approach has resulted in significant improvements to company policies and employee support systems. The extended parental leave benefits, the flexible scheduling options, the professional development funding increases, all emerged from insights she gained through the coordinator role. But the damage was already done." Jennifer's expression reflected the complex emotions of someone discovering that a trusted colleague had been living a fundamental lie, regardless of the noble intentions behind that deception. The authentic relationship we had built was suddenly revealed as inherently inauthentic, based on incomplete information about who I actually was. "I need to get back to work," Jennifer said finally, her professional composure masking deeper hurt and confusion. "Congratulations on successfully defending against the takeover attempt, Madam Chairman. I'm glad our concerns about job security were apparently unfounded." Her formal tone and title usage created immediate distance between us, transforming our comfortable working relationship into the awkward dynamic between executive authority and subordinate employee. The peer-to-peer collaboration that had made our marketing project successful was replaced by the institutional hierarchy that my deception had temporarily obscured. "Jennifer," I called as she turned to leave, my voice carrying genuine regret about the circumstances of this revelation. "I value the professional relationship we built, even though I understand why my deception makes that complicated now. Your insights and feedback made me a better leader, and I hope we can eventually find a way to work together that honors both your contributions and your trust." She paused without turning around, her posture reflecting the complex processing required to reconcile 18 months of professional relationship with the sudden revelation of my actual identity and authority within the organization. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it's going to take time to understand what was real and what was performance in our working relationship." As Jennifer disappeared into the elevator banks leading to the marketing department, Patricia and I rode up to the executive floors in heavy silence. The successful defense against Meridian's takeover had preserved Davidson Financial's independence and protected thousands of jobs. But the personal cost of my dual identity strategy was becoming increasingly clear. The board meeting that afternoon focused on post-takeover integration planning and strategic initiatives for strengthening Davidson's market position. My contributions drew on insights gained from the coordinator role, particularly regarding employee communication strategies and operational efficiency improvements that would support sustainable growth without compromising company culture. However, the morning's encounter with Jennifer had highlighted the ethical and relational complications that would follow my transition back to full-time executive leadership. The authentic relationships built during my coordinator role were now complicated by questions about deception, manipulation, and the power dynamics that had been temporarily obscured but never actually eliminated. Over the following weeks, word of my dual identity spread through Davidson's Chicago office with the inevitable momentum of workplace gossip. Reactions ranged from admiration for my unconventional leadership approach to suspicion about my motives and resentment about the deception involved in gathering insights about employee experiences. Marcus Williams, to his credit, handled the revelation with professional maturity, recognizing that his attendance monitoring concerns had been based on incomplete information about my actual responsibilities. However, our working relationship was permanently altered by the knowledge that his supervisory authority had been essentially fictional during my time as a coordinator. Michael Torres expressed grudging respect for my commitment to understanding operational realities, but also voiced concerns about the ethics of gathering employee feedback through deception rather than transparent communication channels. His perspective reflected the complex feelings of many Davidson employees who appreciated the policy improvements that had resulted from my insights while questioning the methods used to obtain them. The most difficult conversation came with Eleanor Winters, Davidson's founder, who summoned me to her office for a frank discussion about the leadership lessons learned from my dual identity experiment. Her assessment was characteristically direct and insightful. "You gained valuable insights about organizational dynamics and employee perspectives," she observed, "but you also created trust issues that will take years to fully resolve. Leadership requires authenticity, and authentic relationships can't be built on foundations of deception, regardless of noble intentions." Her criticism stung because it was accurate. The coordinator role had provided unprecedented insights into organizational culture and employee experience, but it had also demonstrated the limitations of leadership approaches that relied on deception rather than transparent communication and genuine engagement. However, she also acknowledged the positive outcomes that had emerged from my unconventional strategy. The policy improvements, the more realistic implementation timelines, and the enhanced employee communication systems had created lasting value that would benefit Davidson employees for years to come. 6 months later, as I settled into my role as full-time chairman without the elaborate dual identity that had defined my leadership development, I reflected on the complex lessons learned from 18 months of living two professional lives within the same organization. The insights gained from the coordinator role continued to inform my executive decisions, particularly regarding the human impact of corporate policies and the importance of understanding operational realities before implementing strategic changes. However, the relationships damaged by my deception served as a constant reminder that authentic leadership required transparency and trust that couldn't be achieved through elaborate performance. Jennifer Walsh eventually accepted a promotion to senior marketing manager, her capabilities recognized partly through insights I had gained about her potential during our coordinator collaboration. Our professional relationship remained cordial but distant, marked by mutual respect and permanent awareness of the complex history between us. The hostile takeover defense had succeeded, Davidson Financial maintained its independence, and thousands of jobs were preserved. The coordinator role had contributed to that success by providing insights that made our employee communication strategies more effective and our operational improvements more realistic. But the true measure of leadership, I had learned, wasn't the strategic success achieved through any means necessary, but the ability to create authentic relationships and organizational culture that could sustain success over time. My dual identity experiment had taught me valuable lessons about organizational dynamics, but it had also demonstrated the limitations of leadership approaches that prioritized information gathering over trust building. As I prepared for another board meeting focused on long-term strategic planning, I carried forward both the insights gained from my unconventional leadership development and the humbling recognition that authentic leadership required ongoing commitment to transparency, accountability, and genuine relationship building with all organizational stakeholders. The coordinator role was over, but the leadership journey it had initiated would continue for years to come, informed by hard-won understanding of the complex relationship between executive authority and operational reality, and the critical importance of maintaining trust and authenticity in all professional relationships. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.